Hi, this is Milani Douglas, and we're here today for another episode of the Curative Collective. The Curative Collective is a great conversation, a series of great conversations with people that are working at the intersection of art, food, and social change as a part of our project Reclamation at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Reclamation is in partnership with 1015 Multimedia and the Family Arts Museum, and we have had a wonderful time talking with people about their work and exploring how they are doing research but also working in community around these issues. Today we are here with Shana Klein, an art historian and author, and she has a book called The Fruits of the Empire, Art, Food, and Politics of Race in the Age of American Expansion. Shana, how are you today?
I'm all right. How about you?
Doing pretty good for a Monday. I'm doing all right.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in chilly Cleveland. The weather just turned, so that's what I'm grappling with.
Yes. Luckily, we're getting a good fall day here in DC.
Okay.
I was so excited to receive information about your book, and because with Reclamation, we've had a chance to talk about a myriad of issues and a myriad of things of how food and art and connect. But this looks like some work that you've been doing for quite some time, looking at the ways that people are using food, that artists in particular are using food to communicate some ideas. So tell us how you came to this research. And I'm very curious, did the food come first or did the art come first?
Yeah, I guess you could say the art came first. So I come from the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I'm really proud to come from this program because I had a curriculum that was really diverse. I learned about art from Central America, Native American art, African American, Latin American art. These are really like pioneering classes that so many of my peers throughout the country did not take in their own curriculum. And so I was exposed to the work of Moises Barrios. He's a Guatemalan painter, contemporary artist. And what he does is he goes around to Banana Republic clothing stores and he paints their display windows. So the mannequins, the clothing, and it got me thinking about how something like even Banana Republic clothing is really politically loaded. The artist urges us to confront, why do we have this clothing brand named after something that is so disparaging? Even the term Banana Republic is damaging. It references countries that are politically unstable, and it also is a stain on our American history because it is a history that is characterized by American intervention and political interference. So long story short, I take this class on Central American art history. I'm exposed to Moises Barrios' work on the banana, and it got me thinking, when were American artists even painting the banana? When did they start doing it? And I started looking in the 1800s and realizing that artists are using food to have larger conversations about the politics of their time period, about the people who are laboring those foods, about where those foods are coming from, and the kind of broader context of national expansion. So once I saw the banana in art, I couldn't unsee it. And it just got the wheels turning and thinking more about what other stories are foods telling us in artworks from the 1800s on.
That's so interesting that you say that, because when I got a chance to look at your book, get a chance to look and see what you were talking about in the table of contents, one main reason that I wanted to have you is because a lot of times this kind of scholarship stays on the shelf, right?
Yeah.
And it takes a long time for this kind of scholarship to actually get into the conversation with an art museum or a artist. And so I thought it was important to do that as soon as we possibly could, because these are really good questions. When and why was food introduced into art, and how was it introduced into art? And so what was one of the most shocking things that you found about America's relationship with food as it is translated through our art?
I think one of the most shocking and disturbing research findings was how attached we are as Americans to this idea of you are what you eat. And it's really used for like the nastiest, darkest purposes in the 1800s, and it still lingers today. So, even going back to the colonial period, many European colonizers felt that if they were to eat Native American corn or if they were to eat Native American food, they would, quote, turn into slow and savage Native Americans. the idea that you are what you eat somehow pollutes your racial, your moral character, if there's even such a thing, right? The idea that it's like taking away some kind of purity. And I saw that a lot with my research on the watermelon, which is definitely my most disturbing chapter in research. And thinking about how this really nasty stereotype that develops in the 1800s, the idea that African American people had this insatiable lust for this fruit, it doesn't die in the 1800s. I mean, it still continues through today. It still has this really powerful attachment to the idea that you are what you eat and that what you eat transforms you and somehow changes your personality, your identity. And one of the most disturbing findings was realizing that that watermelon stereotype has made a resurgence when President Obama was in office, and then now that Kamala Harris is in office. And so these kinds of attitudes are not in the past. They're not just relegated to the 1800s. They make waves of appearances in our current time period.
And I think that's fascinating that you bring it up, or that your research tracks how that's done, right? Because it also, in a way, when you take the art and you isolate it and you just have this characterization of someone with watermelon, right? It takes away from the whole story that's also saying these are also enslaved people, enslaved beings who were not allowed to have any other kind of food, and that white or European colonizers thought that, from my understanding, that they thought the watermelon was actually a poisonous fruit, that they thought it was a fruit that was not good for them. So it was actually the only thing that was like left and was able to, that people, that enslaved Africans could actually have access to. That was one of the ways that I was understood. Did you come across that?
So I could talk for hours about the watermelon. I mean, it has a really political and fascinating history. What I think is so fascinating about it is that essentially watermelon was actually a symbol of agency and power for enslaved African Americans. It is an African fruit. So it came over to the Americas mainly on slave trade ships across the Atlantic. And then when enslaved people had plots of land, one of the few kind of like gardens or amounts of land that they could have that were to themselves, many enslaved people grew watermelon. So it was a way to maintain ancestry and ancestral traditions. It was a way to have control over one's own foodways. And so African Americans had a mastery over horticulture and watermelon cultivation. And I think that's why the watermelon then, more than any other object, was used to try to reverse that for racist purposes, because it had been a symbol of agency and independence and African roots. And so racist white Americans in the 1800s, they took that symbol and reversed it to suggest that African American people were uncivilized, unworthy of citizenship status, and more. And so it was cultivated widely by African Americans in the 1800s.
That's such interesting commentary, because we, in looking at some of the work that you've done and some of the work that other researchers and artists have done, we look at the dehumanization of people as a way to lead to more or greater oppression, or to justify oppression, to justify even policy. So it's also a larger conversation of what role does the artist play in impacting social change and impacting policy on a political level, because these characterizations were definitely used when it came into justifying arguments for policies that impacted Africans in America.
Yeah, so to speak to that level of dehumanization, I think that's in part why it was so hard for me to find any images, like no photographs, trade cards, advertisements of Black people actually cultivating watermelon. Like that would have shown too dignified, sadly enough, of an image of, Black people in the 1800s, when it was much more acceptable and people were more comfortable seeing the most racist, caricatured images of African Americans. And so it was really hard for me to even uncover any images of Black people cultivating the fruit, because it was something that they, had such a mastery over. And then another thing you said reminded me that the word I use to teach images of watermelon in the classroom is relentless. The stereotype was so relentless. I mean, there was no surface that it didn't touch. It was in photographs, it was in prints, it was in high art painting. And it was not just in the South, it was in the North, it was in the West, it was in California, all the way to Hawaii.
Wow.
And so, yeah, there's something so disturbing about just how relentless it was, but also that's what makes it so dangerous, that it was in every area of the country, in every corner of the United States, and also on every surface, that it was so pervasive, and not just for exclusive audiences.
Mm-hmm. There's a great book, and I can't think of the author's name. I can think of the title now, and it's called Slavery's Exile, and it talks about Maroons in America. And it talks about how, even though she couldn't find examples of Maroon communities, like large Maroon communities, because of course, that kind of information would be suppressed, because no one would want to tell a story of enslaved people who also made communities for themselves, who also were able to organize themselves. So that was totally oppressed. But when you look at the rewards or the advertisements, and you're seeing, it gives a great deal of detail about, where these people are and what they did. And so I bring that up to say, I find it fascinating that we may have to, like, sometimes looking at what was characterized or what was, dehumanized as a pathway to find out more about what enslaved people were cultivating. So if you were dehumanized for sugar, was there information, that they brought over about sugar? If you were dehumanized about watermelon, was there information about that enslaved Africans brought over about these crops that they later tried to strip their understanding of? Because we also know that certain enslaved communities were chosen because where they came from had certain cultivation skills. And so that they were chosen specifically from certain tribes to come here. So I find that fascinating, and hadn't thought about it myself. I do want to talk more about with the banana. What has that given you some information about what's happened to people of indigenous roots in this country, and how they were also characterized with these images?
So let me backtrack just a second, because what you said was like so rich in meaning just a second ago. And I want to pause to just think more kind of methodologically about how this project works, because you're so right. I mean, how do we read kind of the silences in some of these artworks and advertisements when we have such gaping holes in a lot of the archival information that's been collected? For instance, it was so easy for me to find racist imagery. I mean, that's just like sad but true. Like, so many of our archives and major institutions, they have collected images, by mainstream white American culture that have been perpetuating racist ideas and attitudes. And so it was really important for me in this project not to just show those images and confront them, but then to give examples of people who were resisting them or challenging them or working outside of those frameworks and spaces. And so I'm an art historian, right? I'm trained to look at an image and visually analyze it, but actually so much of my practice is to read what's not in the picture plane, to try to recover the voices, the workers, the laborers, consumers, whoever it may be, that's not pictured in the picture plane, and to think about who has been erased or written outside of the composition, and how can we kind of reinsert them back into the painting or the advertisement. When it comes to the banana, you had asked, can you say that again? Something about indigenous.
I was curious about, when the banana was introduced. You said in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And from what people, and then how did this presentation of the Banana Republic, and how did that impact how this group of people were also perceived in American society?
Okay, so the banana has also a really long history, like any food. It comes from Asia. Also, there's evidence in the Mediterranean. When it's grown in Latin America, people in the United States try to take advantage of that, because the truth is, unlike most foods, Americans were really scared of or did not like exotic foods. The banana was not that case. The banana was the exception. When people in the United States first tasted the banana, they went nuts over it. Like, they loved it immediately and they wanted it. But they realized that we don't have the right climate to cultivate the fruit. We have a semi-tropical climate in some areas of the country, but it's not hot enough. It's not kind of equatorial enough for us to grow it on a large scale. So a few banana entrepreneurs start cultivating a large scale, broad business in the Caribbean and areas of Latin America, and start importing the fruit to the United States. And when they do this, Americans were very strategic in separating the way that they're eating the banana from the way that the banana is eaten in the tropics. So they call it the tropics. And they make a lot of racist claims that people in the tropics are so lazy, all they have to do is leave their hammock and pluck the fruit from a tree and eat it. So Americans in the United States don't want to do that. When they import the banana, they make new silverware items for the banana. We have banana knives and banana spoons invented in the 1800s. We also have banana pedestals and banana boats created to display the banana like a work of art in the dining room. So everything was to segregate the consumption of the US banana from the way it's eaten in the tropics.
That is absolutely fascinating, because then that goes back to the point of, I am going to eat the fruits of your labor while denying your labor and denying your cultural practices around the fruit.
That's right.
Which then leads to something that separates you, this culture, from something that I greatly benefit from.
Yes,
that's
Milan,
so
you
fascinating.
said it perfectly. Yeah,
that's fascinating.
You said it perfectly. And just, to be really frank and straightforward, it just shows you how food has historically in this country been used as a device for white supremacy. I mean, that everything around it was used to extol values of whiteness and to elevate it at the expense of other cultures and communities outside of what's considered white American.
What's also inside of that to me is that I hadn't thought of before, is how much waste must exist for white supremacy to be upheld. So what I'm saying is this. Okay, so you have a banana that could be perfectly peeled, right? And it could be, maybe cut up, or you could boil it. You can do all these things. But I'm thinking about the energy that it must have taken to say, how much mental energy was put into coming up with a banana knife, a banana spoon, a banana this, a banana that, a banana plate, a banana pedestal, and how much of that energy and innovation could have been used to something else if a person of European descent wasn't trying to uphold a supremacist system. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, there probably could have been, we might have had the cure for, like, I don't know, smallpox or something back then.
So all the thinking about all the resources and the energy used just to kind of separate the banana from the way it's consumed by other cultures. Like, think about what we could have accomplished with those resources and those tools. And let me be clear, not everyone ate the banana with a banana knife or on a banana pedestal. That was really kind of aspirational. It was certainly accessible to middle class and upper class Americans. But that was considered to be like the idealized way of eating and displaying the fruit. But I think you're also touching on something that has become really fashionable and important in scholarship, which is the study of the Anthropocene. So the idea of looking at how nature has been used, and ideas of environmental sustainability in the 1800s and earlier. The idea of, like, what resources were Americans exploiting? How were they manufacturing completely new landscapes or new materials at the expense of the natural world and the natural environment to create some of these rituals? Because, like you're saying, they were essentially exploitative, right? Like, we could have been using that energy for arguably more noble purposes.
Right. This is, and I think a lot of times when we are looking at how art, food, anything in the society upholds a system of white supremacy, a lot of times we're moving further away from it. We're not looking at the kind of labor that goes into, or the dehumanization of self by a person of European descent when they're upholding the system, or anyone that's upholding the system. We're looking at its impact on other people, but we're not looking at, wow, that really took a lot of your innovative energy to come up with these new strategies to separate and oppress people. And I think
That's
this
right.
been I never ever I'll never look at a banana the same again, because I won't, because
I know, I'm sorry. It's my
no,
fault.
it's okay. I think it's such a rich conversation, because even when we get into the hybridization of bananas, which is a whole other scientific topic that we don't have to explore here, because we know the smaller bananas, when you go into a more tropical climate, is very different than the banana that we get a
Yeah,
standard banana at a store, and
right.
why that was done. So even the aesthetics of how we even grow food, it's now my mind is like,
Yeah, well, also, so, we keep going back to that idea of dehumanization because you're so right. I mean, that's really integral to this conversation. That is so purposeful, right? The idea of dehumanizing the worker, the labor, or even the consumer, and that artists are going to such lengths as to literally paint the person out of the picture, right? That's why it was really hard for me to find any representation that showed a lot of the people cultivating this work. There were not a lot of images of Chinese laborers cultivating American grapes because many Americans felt that Chinese people were polluting the American grape with their quote filthy feet stomping American grapes. The same thing
wow.
of, taking out the tropical laborer in depictions of the banana, not showing, black watermelon workers and growers. Like there is a very literal painting the person out of the picture plane in a very clear example of dehumanizing someone and really taking away the humanity so much that you don't see any part of the person from that still life or that depiction.
Well, because agriculture requires innovation, it requires intellect, it requires sophistication,
Yeah.
it requires civilization,
Yeah.
right? When you're talking about making an agriculture, you're talking about agriculture. Um, and so there is no way that you could present something that is so indicative of how a society survives
Yeah.
by people that you also want to create policies to oppress.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Mm.
And one culture or community that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's like really vital, is the fact that all this land that I'm talking about, in which people are cultivating fruit on for, an American consumer public, it is stolen indigenous land. Okay, so
Wow.
there's also
Mm-hmm.
like another huge story here about how even like people who are oppressed on this landscape, that landscape is itself stolen and at the expense of other people who have been oppressed. So there's like layers of oppression here that go into these representations that might seem so innocent and so straightforward and something to just like decorate our homes with, but they really triggered larger conversations about who should own that land, who should have the right and privilege to cultivate food on that land, and who people even want to be citizens in this country.
And this is why I felt that it was so important for your to talk about this research that you've done and to amplify it, because a lot of times there's so many rich conversations that are happening about the role of the museum in today's time, and also the politicization, I'm saying it wrong, of the museum, and is it a neutral place? And when I look at something like landscapes from the 1800s, and we're not seeing any of that, or landscapes from the 1600s, and we're not seeing any and people indigenous to this country as a part of that landscape, or we're not even seeing any kind of self depiction of an artist depicting themselves or seeing that food culture there. And if you're showing it without that layered narrative, you have immediately politicized the space,
That's right.
and if there isn't art that shows that, it is immediately political, and now we have to deal with it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's almost like no winning. Either you're like trying to be apolitical or too political, and it's really messy, but I also love that messiness.
Yeah.
I think that these are the kinds of things that bring out the greatest conversations in my classroom, for instance. And I think that you're right. I mean, no institution is neutral. I can tell you that because many of my students have never even been inside a museum, and they feel intimidated to go into a museum. And I am in my discipline to dismantle that. Like, I'm certainly not in art history to uphold those values and those standards and to continue the elitism. Like, I want all of my students and I want all of my readers to feel comfortable looking at art, to feel comfortable going into a museum. But at the same time, like you said, because our institutions maybe are not neutral, that even tarnishes like some of the work I'm doing, because I'm only using a population of materials that are accessible to me, chosen by the institution. And so I'm like trying to work within the framework of the institution to change it. But those possibilities I recognize are so limited. Like, like what a lot of people are saying is that we have to like get rid of the institution, get rid of the framework, and discover something new. I'm not that creative. I can't imagine what that looks like. So I'm limited by at least trying to change the institution from within, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's fascinating that your work is, I don't even think intentionally so, or maybe it is a marvelous, it's a marvelous critique of museums in the work that's available to research, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a great critique of it. And as when I look at a book that's like so scholarship based, and I'm like, wow, it's so sad that so many of these books don't get into these conversations because they have other intentions that the author may not even know how it can be used. You know what I'm saying? And then also the other critique of it is something that you said at the very beginning, which I find fascinating, is that your school and the diversity of your program at we're in New Mexico.
New Mexico, yeah.
Right. And then what other people are missing and how much they're paying so much money, but they're getting an education that is denying them. And I would love to hear you talk about like of how upholding systems of white supremacy are denying a larger part of the population, and in my opinion, making them unable to handle today's challenges.
Yeah,
because they're not equipped with a certain level of information. And how did New Mexico prepare you, and what's missing?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I'll give you a quick example. So I was talking to a colleague of mine at another institution, and we had spoken about how at the University of New Mexico, I have specialties in African American art, Native American art, with pioneering scholars there. And so in speaking to a colleague at another institution, they were telling me how they teach on American art just like I do, and they couldn't believe like how much curriculum I had in my American art course on Native American art. And I was just sort of like in my head kind of mind boggled by this. Like, how do you teach American art and not teach Native American art? Like, that is American art to me. Like, that's art of the Americas. You can't teach a seminar on American art from, whenever, 1600 to the 21st century and not include Native American art and production. And so a lot of our survey course textbooks and a lot of professors now are scrambling to try to be more inclusive and incorporate African, Native American, Mexican American art into their coursework. And they are a little bit scared. They feel that the current climate of 2021 is challenging them to create courses that are more inclusive, more diverse, and they don't have the specialties that are equipping them to do so. And so, like I said, they're scrambling and they're trying to figure it out. And I love that they're trying to figure out, right? I mean, that to me shows even just like a shift in consciousness, that they're now more aware. And even though I wish they had been doing it like decades ago,
right?
I guess now is better than, never. But at the same time, I can also tell you, like, I'm not, I don't want to claim to be like the most woke or entitled person either. Like some of my survey classes on Renaissance to modern art, they don't have a lot of Asian art history or African art history. These are subjects that I didn't learn a lot about in my curriculum, as diverse as it was. And so I'm reaching out to my colleagues in those disciplines and I'm asking them, like, what would you include? Can you help me like learn how to pronounce this artist's name and so on? And so I think we're all trying to get up to speed and recognize that what we were teaching before was not sufficient. It was not doing a service to our students or to the art makers of the past. And we're all like, doing our best to try to create a curriculum that is more just and more equitable. Does that kind of answer?
No, it really does. It definitely answers my question. And it opens up, even larger conversations about how as I see people, moving towards a lot of change and the work that they're doing and the kind of research that it takes, and yes, we're making these fun, where everything, it's like all hands on deck, right? You
Yeah.
have to do that. What I'm not seeing as much of is that I find fascinating. If I had received an education that was completely without these layers of diversity, and I paid a lot of money to
Yeah.
have an education, I would feel that this system, I would feel like this was dehumanizing to actually only to limit what I have access to.
Mhm.
And then how am I working to make sure that at my school that doesn't happen to someone else?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hoping that at least the people asking bigger questions, because people are ill-equipped to deal
Yeah.
with the issues at hand.
So I recognize this is being recorded and it's going to be online in perpetuity. So I'll try to say this with as much grace as possible without getting myself into trouble. I've been educated at brand name institutions and non-brand name institutions. And I can tell you, it's like the non-brand names is where to go. Like that's where you get the best education. And that's where you get like the freshest ideas and the youngest ideas. And I have experience in working at institutions that are much more traditional and have the brand name, and working with like the greatest colleagues there, but they're not up to date and they're not thinking more holistically about how to teach art history at a level that again does service to one's students and to the current cultural climate. And so I don't encourage my students to like go to a brand name institution or to not go to one, but I do encourage them to look at what course listings they have, like who's teaching what subject, what is being marginalized or what is being foregrounded. These are the kinds of things you have to look at as an undergraduate or a graduate student. And I'll also tell you something that I find really disturbing on the job market. You're starting to see, and I didn't expect the conversation to go this direction, you're starting to see these job titles, like these call for jobs for like global art. So in the job description, they're asking for a professor who can teach Asian art, African diasporan art, African American art, Latin American art, like all within this one job title, which is so ridiculous. Like, how can you expect anyone to teach all of those cultures, let alone the fact that all those cultures are like cultures of color? So what they're really saying in those call for jobs is they want a person of color to teach art of color. And I don't think that's just like such a Band-Aid on the larger problem, right? Like for me, you should never, if it were up to me, you should never have a call for a job like that. It should be so much more specific. And on top of that, I don't want to see my Black friend in art history have to get a job in African American art. If she's studying Renaissance art, she should get the job for Renaissance art and so on. Like people of color shouldn't have the burden of teaching art of color. And on top of that, the burden of teaching like all of these different cultures that are so widespread. That's like just my TED talk for today.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you should really do a TED talk about it.
But do you know what I mean? Isn't that disturbing?
It's quite disturbing. And there's an author, a historian and scholar that I love reading his work, Asa Hilliard, and he talks about how racism is really a mental disorder, and he talks about how that it is a mental disorder of people that are even in the position to make some of these decisions, right?
Yeah.
And so it's what's underneath of that question of that listing, global art, right?
Yeah.
Is okay, who are you making this job title for?
Right.
And what are you trying to create? Because some people say the system, it doesn't work. Well, actually it does work. It works in upholding standards or upholding an older system of oppression that benefits a few people. So it does work to have a global art, right?
Right.
So if you want a system that does something else, and if we want art to do something else, it almost makes me wonder, like, how do we make sure that a person who is making a decision about positions and titles and the books that are being read, what is their level of sanity when it comes to, racism, racial politics, and understanding of race in America? Because if they are in a position of it still being a disorder, are they positioned to make that? And I don't think we plan to go here, but this is the beauty of these conversations.
I love it.
Art is here. This is where art is, right?
No, I love talking about this. And I think that art history is the perfect platform to have these conversations because so much of art has historically been considered autobiographical. And so it comes into conversations about cultural appropriation and like who should have the authority to depict the Black figure or, the white figure, and larger conversations about who has access to the discipline and who doesn't. But you're absolutely right. I mean, who is making these call for jobs, right? Like they should be maybe evaluated or like consulted. And then you also see a lot of new positions opening for like diversity. What are they called? Like director of diversity initiatives or director of, education and inclusion and things like this. And, I was thinking about that a little bit before our talk today, because you're coming from the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And, I talk about this with my students, like, why do we have NMWA?
Right.
Why do we need an entirely separate institution to display art by women? Because what are the more like mainstream institutions not showing, to the point where we have to create our own institutions to display the artists and the artworks that are not being shown and that are being pushed to the side? So yeah, I think these are really important conversations to have, even within the institution, right? To think about, one day, like, wouldn't it be kind of cool if NMWA didn't exist, because our museums were doing like a better job more broadly for incorporating everyone? I mean, women are what, 50%, more than 50% of the population. And you go into a museum and they're represented as muses and models and rarely as the producers of those artworks on the wall. So these are things that undergird everything that I study and everything that I teach and research.
And I think it's so fascinating to think of it that way, because it's like, okay, what if the National Museum of Women in the Arts, or any museum that is focused on representing people that are not in the mainstream, what if it actually was a space that you actually just did deeper study, right? So instead of all the museums are showing everyone equally, but if you want to specialize and if you want a deeper experience, if you want to dive deeper, if you want the librarian and you want the resources and the art on the walls to take you to maybe the journals of Elizabeth Catlett, things that you would never ever see, that it actually could be a specialty place, that it could actually be a space to do a deeper level of understanding, not necessarily, oh, by the way, this does exist.
Yeah.
I think we have to rethink it all.
Yeah, I love that idea. And just even on a more basic level. So a lot of my students, they'll enter the museum and you'll know that a museum wall label, I think there's some law where, longer than 145 words, people tune out, or, I don't remember the exact number, like 165 or something. And a lot of my students also feel intimidated because they go in the museum and sometimes they see these very minimalist labels, right? Like artist title, date, and like when it was acquired. And they're supposed to just look at the painting and understand what's going on, like as if it's going to be this aha moment where they suddenly just like realize the meaning and interpretation of the work. No, like going into a museum, you really can't be lazy. Like you have to come with some education, or you have to like have a docent guide you around, or you have to like have many conversations about people who know like the greater historical context behind that Catlett print, for instance. And so I think that museums in some ways can do more to foster opportunities for viewers and visitors to go into that deeper dive, like you're saying.
Because I think that we forget how much what the artist is trying to do, what they're saying with their work, the research that goes into it, the sketches, the journal. Imagine if that innovation could inform the next science, the next architecture, that it forces people, almost like the way that sci-fi moves our minds. I'm wanting us to get to a place that art moves us, continuously to innovate and to be also think about humanity on a deeper level, and not from an elite level of like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which was really, stolen from indigenous cultures and their structures of society. That's a whole other conversation. But when you're looking at saying, oh, I am actualized because I'm able to see art deeper, what if that was just a part of the community level? What if it was a part of every day that art inspired us this way? Yeah, so I think your work really, brought so many interesting questions, as you can tell from me, that I'm like, I'm so inspired by it. And we haven't even had a chance to really talk about your next project. So let's definitely, I don't want to leave without us talking about, you're working on some new research. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I found this niche between art history and food studies. And these are like two worlds that haven't really collided a lot in scholarship. And so I want to stay there because I think it's so productive and there are so many more conversations to be had, like whether it's through books or coursework and so on. And so as I was researching my current book on the fruits of empire and looking at the politics of food, I started seeing images of milk that started like churning my brain. And I'm not just talking about any milk. I'm actually really fascinated with breast milk, which I know sounds like kind of unusual and quirky. But, I also was starting to discover photographs of women breastfeeding in the 1800s that really challenged me, because in the Victorian period, it was like a very buttoned up culture. It was impolite to even show your ankles in public. And so to have these women exposing their breasts and breastfeeding a child while looking straight into the camera really made me think, like, how is breast milk defined? What is the culture around breastfeeding that these women feel empowered and like wanting to take to the camera to show themselves doing this activity? And I'm realizing that breast milk, like fruit, is very racially charged. Like there are texts and manuals that talk about how white women need to produce white milk to carry on the next generation of white citizens. Like there's a whiteness, a value of whiteness attached to breast milk. And it also has me thinking, where are the images of Black women breastfeeding? Breastfeeding for especially American Southerners, Southern white women, it had been relegated to enslaved women. And so I'm thinking about how motherhood is itself this kind of colonial device, and this device of like uneven power dynamics, who's represented, who's not, whose milk is considered pure and authentic, whose isn't, and how is white motherhood being shaped at the expense of others. So that's like just a brief summary of the kinds of things I'm thinking about in the future. And I'd love your feedback or if you have any resources.
Yeah, that is fascinating conversation right there. As a person, as a Black woman who grew up from generations of herbalists and midwife and doulas, and I had a midwife in my birth, and breastfed, and was surrounded by a community of Black and Indigenous women who did this, and then also having the shock of finding out in several ways how it was very unnatural, but also the shock of how I was treated because I wanted to breastfeed when I was outside of those environments of being in that more natural herbalist, herbalism, doula, midwife, that kind of more community. The moment I stepped out of it, I mean, it was like sold, something like it's just
right,
unbelievable. And then also the disconnection of the herbs that can help support breast milk. But what I also found fascinating is that, yes, coming across the research that says, white women must produce white milk, but also a plethora of research and images that also show how motherhood was outsourced to Black bodies and Black women's bodies, right? And so that women would be impregnated just so that they could produce milk for a white baby. And so I think that you're going to hit so many things.
So there are also an equal amount of haunting photographs of Black enslaved charges and nurses and nursemaids holding white children. I mean, that is really like the declaration of that uneven power dynamic that's happening in the 1800s. And, you know, we don't have a lot of information about maybe the Black sitters in these photographs, but I think their gaze says it all. I mean, they're not smiling, and, you know, they have like a very kind of like powerful, you know, look at the camera. And I think it just says so much about how they are mothering, but you don't see any photographs, to my knowledge, of them mothering their actual children. And it's not that they're not. It's because, like you're saying, their labor is being outsourced in so many different directions. And, you know, it talks about a larger conversation about how slavery was made possible on the backs of Black women, right? It was hereditary. And so it was Black women who were producing another generation of enslaved people for Southern plantations. And so pregnancy itself is politically charged in the time period. It's not just breastfeeding. And it's like, who's pregnant, who's not, for what purpose, and how much power do they have? How little power do they have? It's like so messy and complicated.
And I'll have to send you this fascinating article by an herbalist named Karen Culpepper. And so she talks about how cottonwood was an herb that enslaved women would boil to prevent them from getting pregnant.
Yes. Okay. So I've heard that. And then there's another herb. There's a couple of them that cause their abortions, essentially. I forgot.
Yes. Like Black Cohout. There's a couple of them that, for reasons of not knowing who would be watching and the dangers of it, I wouldn't want to mention here. But then also in that article, she talks about how when the enslavers and colonizers found this out, that they would then put an herb in the water that would prevent the cottonwood from working.
Wow. I haven't heard that.
I'll have to send you that article. I think it'll be fascinating for your research, because even though it's it's connected because it's talking about birth and pregnancy. So that's fascinating. I get the impression that you and I could probably talk with.
I know, right? Let me just insert one other thing, because I found this to be really interesting. So and a lot of enslaved women would try to breastfeed for longer periods of time, also because that was a way to stave off pregnancy. I mean, that's not like, you know, a surefire way of doing so. It's not like scientific by any means, but it certainly does. It can delay getting pregnant again. And so breastfeeding was, you know, strategic in that way. So yeah, there's a lot to examine around the different strategies that particularly enslaved women are doing to try to like maintain control over their bodies.
And that brings us right back where we started, agency. And having agency of what you grow, what you do with your body, what becomes of your labor, how you benefit from your labor, and how art represents or misrepresents that agency. I think it's such a powerful conversation. If anyone is interested in getting your book, which I hope they are after this conversation, because we've gotten into some really juicy stuff. Where can they find you, and where can they get? Also, you have a discount code for us as well. So tell us more about it.
Well, I'm embarrassed to report that academic books are tragically expensive. Like, if it were up to me, it would be much more accessible. I think my book right now retails for $65, but you can get a 40% discount with the code that I provided one of the administrators. So maybe they can put that somewhere.
Yeah, she'll probably put it up in here. And then also, if you could, I think that we can find you. Where can we find you on Instagram?
Yeah. So my book's at the University of California Press. It's also on Amazon, but you can stay in touch with me on Instagram. I'm at The Fruits of Empire. And it's a really good way to communicate with me. I post something once a week about food and a work of art. And sometimes I publicize the events and the lectures I'm giving. So that's a great way to stay in touch. And I would love to hear feedback from anyone who's listening, or anyone who's interested in collaborating.
And would you be able to put access to that link in your bio on Instagram?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, awesome. And we'll make sure that we also post a link to it once the conversations are posted. Shayna, this conversation has been wonderful.
I agree. I had so much fun talking to you.
Good. I'm glad, and hopefully we find ways to continue to keep this conversation going.
What do you think about us doing an exhibition on motherhood at Nimwa? Should that
Oh,
be
you
in
know
our
what?
future?
Yeah, that is something to definitely consider. And
Okay,
unfortunately, one of the things we have not dismantled is how long the exhibition schedules can be
sure.
at museums. It can be amazing. But the benefit of public programs, which is a way that we're able to like kind of push things forward, is that we can have these kind of conversations and do other kind of programs
Yeah,
and be able to move a little bit faster. But
love it.
exhibition schedules at museums, I mean, we're already talking about
Like
2025.
5 years ago.
It's
I
crazy.
know.
It's
Totally
insane.
crazy.
It's
Yeah.
insane. But like anything else, anything that has ever happened, it happens by continuous conversations, usually at tables. I'm at my own kitchen table right now, usually
Yeah.
at tables and often related to food.
That's right.
So Shayna, I'm glad that we could continue that tradition of bringing forth new innovative ideas in our discussion about food and art. And thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you, Milani, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to more collaborations in the future.
All right, wonderful. Please join us next Monday for Curative Collective. We always have some interesting conversations. We try to get our guests to talk about the things that maybe they don't get a chance to talk about, and regular panel discussions, and trying to get those sound bites and get to these juicy conversations. So see you next week for that, and thank you.